In the blink of an eye, everything changed. Bright tongues of flame burst from the window, and the screams of the man being saved tore through the silence of the night. The black man, who barely had time to comprehend what was happening, rushed towards the burning car. His heart pounded in his chest as he opened the door and, with difficulty tearing the boy from the embrace of the fire, felt the heat burning his skin. But what was supposed to be an act of heroism turned into a nightmare. The police who arrived on the scene immediately assessed the situation, and instead of thanking their savior, his hands were handcuffed. Excitement, fear and confusion filled the air as the man found himself behind bars. Do you think this is fair? Share your opinion in the comments. Write your name and where you are watching this video from. It is very important for us to know each of you. Your support helps us promote our channel and share important stories. We appreciate you and your activity. You make our content better. Enjoy watching. The sun sank slowly below the horizon, painting the sky in warm shades of pink and orange. In the small town, everything seemed to be going on as usual. Children played in the street, neighbors chatted, and the smells of dinner wafted from houses. It was an ordinary evening, when life seemed to go on forever, without knowing troubles. James, a middle-aged black man, was returning from work, tired but happy. He was dreaming of spending time with his family, perhaps watching an old movie with his kids or playing board games. He had a small smile on his face as he passed his neighbors, greeting each one with a familiar nod. At this time his thoughts were far from the disturbing events that were soon to occur. He stopped at a store to buy a few groceries and noticed a young mother with a white boy, about 8 years old, laughing and playing with him. It brought back warm memories of his own children, how they once laughed and enjoyed simple things. The lights started to turn on one by one as James walked out of the store with a bag in his hands. In the distance, around the corner, he noticed something strange, black smoke billowing into the sky. At first, he didn't pay any attention to it, but then his attention was drawn to the screams coming from that direction. His heart began to beat faster, and instinctive alarm told him that something was wrong. Turning the corner, he saw a car engulfed in flames. Huge tongues of flame were shooting out of the windows, and hysterical screams were coming from inside. It was the same car that the young mother had just left with her little boy. Without thinking, James rushed towards the burning car. He knew that time was against him. Every moment could cost him his life. Blinded by the fire's glare and feeling the heat, James moved closer. He saw the boy trapped in the back seat, his face twisted in fear. The moment stretched as he felt the adrenaline pulsate, and he took a deep breath and opened the car door. The flames seared his hand, but he didn't back away, every beat of his heart calling him to action. He grabbed the boy with an effort and, pulling him out of the car, felt the fire rushing out. As if wanting to engulf them both, they fell to the ground and James covered the boy with his body, protecting him from the hot sparks and debris. At that moment, when everything seemed saved, sirens blared around him, but instead of the expected words of gratitude, he felt anxiety overwhelm him. The police who arrived at the scene were not prepared to perceive the situation as heroism. In the eyes of the officers, he saw only bewilderment and suspicion. So in one moment, when life should have been happy about being saved, everything turned into fear and misunderstanding. James did not know what to expect, and only just managed to realize that his actions could be the beginning of a nightmare. The screams that tore through the silence seemed so sharp that they pierced the air like sharp blades. It was not just a scream, but a scream of fear that sounded from the very depths of the soul. James, knowing that every moment counted, rushed towards the car, where the flames danced ominously, as if they were eager to devour everything around them. Flames, bright yellow and orange, burst out of the open windows, hot as welding. The flames quickly consumed the metal. It began to deform, as if under pressure. Sounds were heard inside the car, mixed with the crackling of burning wires and the crackling of the windshield, which seemed about to shatter into 1,000 pieces. James tried to make sense of what was happening through the boy's deafening screams and the hellish roar of the flames. A sense of panic filled his thoughts. "Hold on, I'm coming," he shouted, even though he knew the boy probably couldn't hear him over the chaotic symphony of horror. As he ran to the car, he felt heat piercing his skin like hot needles. The door was jammed, and every push he made toward it felt hopeless. Inside, he saw a boy pinned against the back seat, his eyes full of fear, looking for salvation, but his small body couldn't cope with the hell that was unleashing itself around him. James, gathering all his strength, suddenly pushed the door with all his might. The metal creaked, and finally it gave way. At the same moment, a wave of hot air crashed down on him like a bolt of lightning. Inside, it was much worse than he could have imagined. Fire was rapidly consuming the space, and it seemed like the car was turning into an oven. He saw the boy, terrified and weak, huddled in a corner, his face covered in tears and soot. At that moment, James felt the boy's scream echo in his heart. It was not just a scream, it was a cry for help, in which all the hopelessness was felt. "I'll save you," he screamed, though his voice was barely audible, drowned out by the roar of the fire. He grabbed the boy's hand, but the boy was too terrified to move. Time seemed to stand still, and the moment James finally reached him, he felt the flames burning his face and the acrid smoke filling his lungs. With every moment he spent inside, the chances of salvation diminished. The fire grew brighter, reflecting the fear in the boy's eyes. James reached for it again, his heart pounding in his chest, and with the last of his strength, he cried out, "Hurry, hold on to me." The boy, not believing his ears, hugged James as if he was his only hope. And in that moment, when their bodies met, an invisible bond was formed between them, a bond that could save them both. James knew that every moment was a fight against time. He pulled the boy out, and when they got outside, the heat of the fire burned them. But in that moment their eyes met, and he saw a spark of hope in the boy's eyes. But the joy was short-lived. Suddenly, sirens blared, and at the same moment, the police rushed past like shadows, merciless and cold. The rescue that should have been the culmination of heroism now turned into fear and ignorance. James did not know that his actions would be interpreted in a completely different way than he expected. And with every scream that came from the burning car, he knew that their lives had changed forever. James's heart was pounding so hard he felt like it might jump out of his chest. Fear and self-preservation were fighting inside him. The moment he saw the burning car and heard the screams, everything else disappeared. There was no fatigue, no worries about tomorrow, the neighborhood store, the evening with the children, the warmth of home, all of it dissolved in smoke and fire. He stood on the edge of reality, facing the most terrifying situation imaginable. Every instinct he had was telling him to run, to save himself, to stay safe, but a thought flashed through his mind, stopping him in his tracks. "There's a child inside." That thought was the catalyst that pushed him toward the car, despite the unbearable fear. James took a step forward, every movement a struggle. The heat rising from the flames seared his face, causing him to wince. He looked at the burning car body, seeing the metal spark and warp as if the fire itself was consuming it. The sounds, crackling and booming, mingled with the screams that continued to tear through the air. This was not just a one-time incident. It was something much bigger. It was a test of his courage and humanity. With each step he took, he realized that the choice had already been made. He couldn't stand by, couldn't remain a passive bystander. He had to act. A spark of determination ignited inside him that he had never felt before. This wasn't just saving one boy. This was a chance to prove himself, to show that life matters, that each of us can be a hero, even when the odds are stacked against us. Swallowing the fear that rose in his throat, James took another step. Images flashed through his mind, his own children, their laughter, their joy, their carefree moments. It gave him strength. He no longer thought about himself. His mind was focused only on how to save the boy. He saw the fire already engulfing the front seats, and time seemed to stretch. The car door was jammed, but he knew he had to try to open it. James ran closer, feeling the heat become unbearable. Like 1,000 burning hands were covering him. He lowered his head, took a deep breath, and aimed his blow towards the door. The creaking metal answered him with a creaking sound. He pushed the door again, increasing the pressure. More screams came from inside. The boy seemed to have no idea how to get out. "I'm close," James shouted, though his voice was barely audible to his own ears. He knew he couldn't afford to doubt, couldn't let fear get the better of him. After several desperate attempts, the door finally gave way. It swung open with a deafening crash, and James was hit in the face by a wave of heat the likes of which he had never experienced. Inside the car, he was met by chaos, debris, flames, and, in the center of this inferno, a terrified boy's face. Time seemed to stand still. James saw the boy pressed against the seat, his eyes full of panic and tears. In that moment, everything became clear. He couldn't leave. He couldn't leave him there. James took a step inside, his body shaking from the heat, but he couldn't back away. All he could think was, "I won't let this fire take you." Gathering all his resolve, he reached out to the boy, ready to pull him out of this trap. The fear inside him began to give way to fortitude. He knew that he and the boy were on the edge between life and death, between heroism and despair. But in that moment, he knew his decision was right. When James finally squeezed into the car, the world around him changed beyond recognition. He found himself in the center of a hellish inferno, where fire raged like a living creature, ready to devour everything in its path. Darkness and light intertwined in a dance of horror, and burning debris fell like rainwater in a raging storm. The heat seared his face as if he were standing in front of a blazing fireplace. But here, in this enclosed space, he felt the air itself becoming unbearably hot. Every breath was a struggle, the smoke seeping into his lungs, leaving a burning taste. But in this moment, despite the fear, his adrenaline made his heart beat faster, giving him strength. Inside the car, chaos reigned, the crackle of burning plastic, the shattering of glass, and the growing roar of the fire created a symphony of destruction. James realized instantly that time was running out. The boy in the back seat looked completely lost, his eyes full of terror, his lips trembling with fear. This was not just a fight against fire. This was a fight for life. James gathered his courage and rushed towards the boy, his heart pounding as if it wanted to break free. He knew he had to act fast. He reached out his hand towards the terrified child, but the heat rising from beneath him was so intense it felt like it was burning him where it stood. "Hurry!" he screamed, though he was on the verge of despair. The boy, mesmerized by the flames and the terror, did not react. James felt the flames getting closer and closer to them, and every second seemed like an eternity. "I'm here. I'll save you," he screamed again, more insistently this time, and finally saw the boy, holding the seat belt in his small hands, trying to free himself. As the fire raged around him, James gritted his teeth and used all his strength to pull the boy out of the seat. At that moment, the heat became so unbearable that he felt beads of sweat instantly dry on his skin. This was not just a physical test, it was a test of endurance and courage. He glanced at the windows, knowing they could explode at any moment from the heat. At that moment, adrenaline was pumping through his veins, and every muscle in his body was focused on one thing: getting the child out of this hellish fire. Gritting his teeth, he wrapped his arm around the boy's shoulder and, pushing himself away from the seats with all his might, pulled him toward him. The door they had entered through was already smoking, and every spark that fell around them could be the last straw. An inner fire of determination blazed inside him. He could not give up. The boy finally found his voice, his cries of tears and despair mixed with a fiery roar. "Please, don't leave me!" The fear in his eyes made James speed up. He felt his own strength beginning to fade, but it was nothing compared to what this child was going through. As he ran to the door, he felt the heat become unbearable, like 1,000 searing arrows were piercing his body. He knew this could be their last moment. Gritting his teeth, he pulled the door open, but it wouldn't budge, the flames twisting the metal as if the flames themselves were trying to keep them inside. "Hold on tight," he shouted, pushing the door again, and finally it swung open with a deafening crash. For a moment he saw the world outside, dim light, smoke, and fire trucks approaching with sirens blaring. With one last effort, James pulled the boy out of the car and they fell to the ground, embraced by the night. The heat from the flames was still unbearable, but they were free. 100 emotions filled his soul: relief, joy, but also the knowledge that they were both still on the edge. The moment James pulled the boy from the burning car, everything seemed to stop. They stood at the edge of an abyss, and the world around them blurred into a fiery symphony. Huge flames roared out of the windows. The smell of burning filled the air, and the bright light blocked out everything else. And yet, in the chaos, there was one thing: their eyes. When he saw the fear in the boy's eyes, his heart broke into pieces. The boy, about 8 years old, looked so small and defenseless, his face distorted with horror. At that moment, James felt the warmth of fear spreading inside him, chilling his soul. This was not just a rescue, it was a fight for life, full of pain and hope. "I'm here," James shouted, holding out his hand. His voice was as confident as he could be. The boy, still scared, seemed to not believe this was happening. Their eyes met, and in that look James saw a whole range of emotions: fear, hope, and maybe even faith that he could save him. Gritting his teeth, James made a decision. He quickly pulled the boy towards him, feeling the flames burning his hands as if they were trying to stop him. But he couldn't afford to give in. This child deserved a chance, and he, as an adult, had to give it. James's heart was pounding so fast it felt like it might burst from the strain. He pulled the boy toward him, and the boy finally wrapped his arms around his neck. Choking on fear and smoke, their bodies met, and in that moment an invisible bond was forged between them, a bond that crossed barriers of age, race, and fear. "Come on, hold on tight," he shouted, though every breath was a struggle. They were trapped between hell and hope, and he knew they both had to survive. As James lifted the boy into his arms, he felt his own strength failing. The fire raging around them seemed to be trying to pull them back into the flames, but he couldn't let that happen. He had to get out, and he had to get out now. The boy finally gave in, hugging James as tightly as he could. It was as if he was seeking protection, and the feeling gave James strength. He squeezed his eyes shut against the bright light and the onslaught of hot air, but he stepped forward, determined. The door was slightly open, but when he reached for it, it did not budge. Each stroke of flame was like a hammer blow to his spirit. He knew he could not afford to lose this moment. With each passing moment, the heat and smog grew more intense. Gritting his teeth and gathering his strength, he pushed the door again. Finally, it swung open, as if life itself was giving them a chance. With that momentary victory, James felt a surge of strength. This was hope. This was salvation. When they got out into the fresh air, the fire had retreated, but it still danced menacingly behind them. James knelt down, holding the boy in his arms, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Their eyes met again, and in that moment he saw not only fear, but hope, hope that they had survived. "You're safe," he said, relieved, though he still didn't believe it. The boy nodded, his eyes filling with tears, and James felt his own tears welling up. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a new beginning, an act of human bravery and sacrifice. The fire still raged behind them, but for James, for both of them, the moment had come when life took on new meaning. The moment James finally laid the boy down, everything around them changed. The fiery inferno that had just consumed everything was now behind them, but its scars still echoed in their hearts. The silence seemed deafening, the absence of the sounds that had previously torn the air creating an atmosphere of unbearable pressure. The two of them sat on the pavement, and the air was heavy with fear, as if the shadows themselves had retreated, leaving only darkness. James, still unable to comprehend what had happened, looked at the boy. The child's face was smeared with soot, and his eyes were full of tears and fear, but now there was a spark of hope in them. He was still shaking, and as if sensing that shaking fear, James reached out to him, hugging him tighter. "You're safe," he said quietly, but even his own voice seemed like an echo in the void. The boy nodded, but there was more than just fear in his eyes. There was bewilderment there, as if he still couldn't believe they had survived. The fire that had scarred their souls had left a lingering wound in their memories. James pulled back and looked around. The fire trucks had arrived. The cries of rescuers filled the air, but all this fuss seemed to be happening somewhere far away. Like in a fog, he couldn't tear his eyes away from the burning car, from what was left of everything that had once been normal. From an evening walk to dinner with his family, he felt his soul being tormented by an unbearable realization. They were one step away from disaster, and rescue had become impossible. The nearby rescuers, cuffed in uniform, were milling about, trying to make sense of what was happening. But James suddenly felt a sense of unease creeping up on him. He couldn't help but think that now, while his actions had been heroic, he might not be able to escape consequences. He could already see their eyes darting over him, full of bewilderment. Who was he? Why was he there? They said, as if they were looking for a culprit where there should have been a hero. His chest ached. He knew that those around him couldn't see the same horror he did. They couldn't see the boy's fear, couldn't feel him fighting the fire. In their eyes, he could be anything: a suspect, a threat. The thought made his heart clench. "Why is this happening?" the boy asked, his voice shaking. It was a question James himself didn't know the answer to. He just clenched his fists and looked at him. They were both on the edge of understanding, but the world around them was rapidly crumbling. "I don't know," he said, trying to calm himself and the boy, but the feeling of uncertainty filled him. It grew with each passing minute, like the fire they had just survived. It suddenly became clear to him that this was not just the end, it could be the beginning of something terrible. There was a crowd of people ahead, and soon several police officers were heading their way. Their faces were tense, and in their eyes James saw a mixture of curiosity and wariness. His heart began to pound and his stomach began to ache with foreboding. He didn't want his actions to be misinterpreted. He was just a man who did what he had to do. "Are you okay?" he asked the boy, trying to bring him back to reality. The boy nodded, but his eyes were still searching for answers in a world that had suddenly become so scary and incomprehensible. At that moment, despite his physical salvation, James felt conflicting emotions tearing through him: relief and fear, hope and horror. The silence that followed the storm was deceptive. James knew that they would both face more than just escaping the fire. They would have a long road to recovery, and he could already sense how thorny it would be. There would be questions, doubts, and perhaps betrayal ahead, for in a world where the lines between good and evil were blurred, every step could be decisive. Sirens blared through the quiet of the evening as the police arrived on the scene. Bright flashing lights illuminated the scene and James felt the tension building inside him. He was still standing next to the boy, who was shaking with fear. James's heart pounded as he realized that his actions could now be interpreted in a completely different way. Several officers quickly stepped out of their police cars. Their faces were serious, their movements determined. One of them, tall and handsome, approached James. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice authoritarian and wary. "I saved a boy from a burning car," James exclaimed, pointing at the child who was now standing to the side, looking on in fear. But his words, full of passion and anxiety, did not elicit any reaction from the officers. Instead, they exchanged glances, and James felt fear creep into his soul. Face down on the ground, one of the policemen suddenly commanded. Before James could even process what was happening, he felt himself being roughly pushed onto the pavement. The blow was hard, and he couldn't hold back a scream. He realized he was trapped, and his heart started beating faster. His hands were cuffed, and James felt them tighten around his wrists. "I'm not a criminal. I was saving that boy," he tried to explain, but his voice echoed in the desert. Finding no response, the officers showed no understanding. "Witnesses say you were in the car too long," one of the officers said, not looking up from his notes. James felt anger rising in his chest. He couldn't believe his good intentions could be perceived as a crime. The crowd of spectators gathered around watched the scene with bewilderment and fear. James could feel their eyes on him, full of questions and doubts. He wanted to shout for them to understand the truth, but the words stuck in his throat. His gaze met the boy's, and he saw a mixture of fear and hope in his eyes. That look pierced him to the depths of his soul. "Why don't they understand?" he thought, lying on the cold asphalt. The situation became more and more tense with each passing moment. The police continued to behave aggressively, and James began to be lifted from the ground. He felt everything around him crumbling, and a determination arose in his heart. He would fight for his truth, for the fact that he had made the right choice in that terrible moment. James was placed in the back of the patrol car, and the world around him seemed to turn black and white. The words he tried to speak were unintelligible. The police officers, looking at each other, seemed confident that they knew how to interpret this situation. Their every movement, every glance, expressed mistrust and wariness. "We've received several calls from witnesses," one of the officers said, addressing James as if he were just one of the suspects. His voice was cold, and there was no room for understanding. "They say you were in the car too long and that your actions could have put the child's life at risk." "I saved him," James cried, his anger rising. "How can you ignore that?" But his words only made the police more wary. They didn't want to listen. To them, he was no longer a hero, but a criminal. Another officer, standing next to the patrol car, crossed his arms and shot James a disdainful look. "We have to follow procedure," he said, as if that was the only rule they followed, regardless of the humanity of the situation. The words procedures left James with a sense of profound injustice. He felt like the system he trusted was being turned against him. The accusations leveled at a man who had merely tried to save a life were unbearable. The crowd of spectators watching the scene could not help but feel the tension. James saw some of them whispering among themselves, expressing bewilderment, but even their curiosity did not change the situation. The police were sure they were right, and this gave them even more determination. "You are in no position to ask questions," one of the officers said coldly, leaving James feeling completely powerless. He felt his pride and hope slowly dissolving into thin air. "I just wanted to help," he said, barely holding back tears, but his words fell on deaf ears again. The police continued recording his details and taking notes, ignoring his suffering. James knew that the fight for his truth was just beginning. A determination arose in his mind. He would fight not only for himself, but for all those who faced bias and injustice. This situation should be a lesson, and he would not allow his voice to be silenced. James sat in the back of the patrol car, the cold metal cuffs on his wrists a symbol of his helplessness. Every movement was uncomfortable, and the restraints on his hands only added to the humiliation. He couldn't understand how his good intentions could lead to this situation. There was silence inside the car, except for the occasional sound of the radio and police chatter. James looked out the window, but the world beyond seemed distant and alien. It all seemed like a nightmare from which he could not wake up. His thoughts raced. How did I get here? Why aren't they listening? The images of him throwing himself into the flames to rescue the boy played over and over in his mind. He could feel the adrenaline still pumping through his veins, but now instead of heroism he felt only anger and helplessness. How could his actions have been so misconstrued? He wasn't a criminal, he was a savior. The officers outside the car were discussing his situation, their voices coming to him like distant noise. He heard the words threat, suspicious, and situation under control. Each word cut into his heart, and he couldn't hold back the tears. James tried to get the attention of one of the officers standing by the car door. "Please listen to me. I did what anyone else would do," he exclaimed, but the officer just waved him off as if his words were empty words. Humiliation washed over him. He couldn't believe he was in this position, shackled, helpless, and unable to understand why the world he lived in was so cruel. His thoughts of justice and kindness disappeared, replaced by fear and a sense of injustice. A determination was building inside him. He knew he had to fight not only for himself, but for others who were in a similar situation. He was not going to let his voice be silenced, his story not heard. This moment was not only a test for him, but also the beginning of a new fight, a fight for truth and equality. As he sat in the car, his thoughts kept returning to how he would tell his story. He knew that at some point he would have to raise his voice, and that would be his true victory. Even with handcuffs on his hands, he felt that his spirit was not broken. A small crowd had gathered outside the patrol car. James could feel the tension in the air growing. He couldn't see their faces, but he could hear whispers and discussions that drifted to him like a gentle wind blowing through his mind. "Did you see what happened? He was in the car too long," one of the onlookers said, a note of judgment in his voice. James tensed at the words, which clearly reflected racial stereotypes and bias. Why did they form opinions so quickly without knowing the full story? "He must be hiding something. Look at the color he is," another voice said. The phrase cut through him like a knife. He felt himself being humiliated, his identity reduced to the color of his skin. In that moment, he realized that his fight was not only for his name, but for those who faced the same thing every day. The crowd continued to talk. and James could feel the eyes of those around him assessing him. Some seemed sympathetic, but most spoke of him as an enemy to be feared. He probably wasn't trying to save you. He was just looking for a chance to hurt you. Someone else added. The words were forever etched in his mind. He closed his eyes, trying to block out their conversations, but the whispers continued to echo in his head. Each word was like a stone thrown into his soul. James knew he shouldn't let those judgmental looks break him, but fear and anger mixed together, creating a storm of emotions inside him. The boy he had saved stood a little to the side, with his mother holding him and trying to comfort him. James felt his heart clench at the thought that now this child would also bear the consequences of this situation, that his life could change because of one tragic minute. The chatter around him continued to mount. They'll probably let him go. He's black, said a woman with brightly colored lips. And the statement, full of prejudice, struck James in the heart. He wanted to scream, wanted everyone to know the truth, but his voice was suppressed. As the crowd discussed him, James realized that this wasn't just his personal struggle, but part of a larger fight against systemic bias and racism. This was more than just being detained. It was confronting the prejudices that exist in society, and he knew he had to be a voice for those who couldn't speak. At that moment, he decided that he would not let them reduce him to a stereotype. He would fight. He would defend not only himself, but all those who faced this injustice, and even if there was only condemnation around him, he would not let it break his spirit. James stood in the courtroom, his heart pounding in his chest as he waited for the trial to begin. The dimly lit room, lit only by the bright light above the judge's desk, felt oppressive. He glanced around, spotting the prosecutor confidently discussing the case with his colleagues. Their faces were filled with disdain and self-righteousness. They looked at him as if he were beneath them. The judge entered the courtroom and everyone stood. James felt the tension in the air. He knew this was not just a trial. This was an arena in which his life and reputation were being publicly judged. The case of James Richards, the judge said, his voice echoing around the courtroom. James felt his knees buckle beneath him. It was as if everything around him had stopped and he was the only one breathing. The prosecutor stood up and walked confidently to the stand. Your Honor, this defendant acted recklessly. His decisions could have put the life of an innocent child at risk, he said, pointing at James. There was hostility in his voice, and it only reinforced the bias James already felt. He knew this wasn't just an accusation, but a whole set of stereotypes being slapped on him. The defense rose, and James's attorney, a dark-haired woman with a stern expression, began her speech. Your Honor, my client acted out of self-preservation and a desire to help. He is not a criminal, but a hero, she said, but her words were too quiet compared to the prosecutor's stinging rebuke. James felt his emotions welling up inside him. Every time the prosecutor said the words threat or crime, he felt a surge of rage. He wanted to stand up and scream that he was not who they were trying to make him out to be. He looked at the face of the boy who had come to the hearing with his mother, and his heart sank. This child had witnessed him trying to save him. At this point, the prosecutor began bringing in witnesses, people who had previously observed the situation. Each one took the stand in turn, and their testimony only emphasized the bias. He looked aggressive. He had an angry expression. With each word, James felt the tide of condemnation building around him. When it came to his presentation, he knew he had to be persuasive. But how could he speak truth when bias had already taken hold? He began to wonder what the chances were of justice in a system that had already decided he was guilty. As the hearing continued, at one point the prosecutor asked a question that cut to the heart. How can you assure us that your intentions were good when you yourself are under suspicion? It was like a punch in the face, and James felt the tension building inside him. His lawyer turned to him and said quietly, "You need to be prepared. We have a long way to go." James nodded, but his mind was occupied with the question, would his voice be heard, or would it forever be overshadowed by bias and stereotypes? The trial was not only a test of his innocence, but also a reflection of a system in which anyone who does not fit into a certain mold can become a victim of bias. James knew that his fight was just beginning, and he had to be prepared to fight for his truth. The courtroom was tense as the prosecutor stepped forward and asked a question that seemed to break all boundaries. How can you say he is a hero when his actions could have led to tragedy? Hero or criminal, what is this man's real intention? The words echoed through the room, and tension filled the air. James felt his heart pounding, and the judge's gaze grew even stern. He felt the tension building, as if there was an invisible tension between those present, ready to explode. You must understand that at a critical moment, your client did not exercise reason. His actions could not only have endangered the life of a child, but also caused chaos among bystanders. The prosecutor continued, looking hard at James. When you listen to his actions, who do you see? A hero saving a life, or a man who acted impulsively, endangering the lives of others? The question struck the room like a thunderclap. James felt his anger rising. He knew that behind this rhetoric were the biases that had dogged him throughout this whole affair. Every breath, every look of condemnation only served to deepen his inner conflict. He was a hero, but he could be made out to be a criminal. The crowd in the courtroom froze, and James noticed several onlookers glance at each other, their whispers growing louder. "He's black," one woman said, and the words echoed in his soul again, like a heavy wall. The bias was there, and he knew the court would not be able to escape its influence. James' attorney, noticing the growing tension, stood up and tried to take charge. "Your Honor, let's look at the facts. This man wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't looking for chaos. He saw a child in distress and he acted. Any man can make a mistake in those circumstances, but that doesn't make him a criminal," she said, trying to convey that James's true nature was to help. But the prosecutor persisted. "Mistakes made under pressure have consequences. Hero or criminal, it's not a question of intent, but of results. If he hadn't intervened, the child might have survived without further danger," he continued, emphasizing each word as if it were a death sentence. James felt a sense of powerlessness creeping up on him. He knew that despite his best attempts to explain his actions, many had already drawn conclusions. They were viewing him through the prism of stereotypes that were deeply ingrained in society. With each new question from the prosecutor, the tension in the room grew. Who is he really? The audience asked each other, and this feeling did not leave James. He felt that his fate was hanging by a thread, and his fight for justice could be unsuccessful. But a spark of determination ignited inside him. He knew he had to speak up. This was his chance to show that he was not just a hero or a criminal, but a man who was willing to risk everything for the life of another. He had to do everything he could to tell his truth, without letting bias cloud his story. When James stood before the court, he felt more than just a defendant. He became a symbol of a system that, instead of supporting him, oppresses him. Every look, every word spoken in the courtroom only confirmed this feeling. His fate was not determined by his actions, but by the biases and stereotypes in which he found himself entangled. The justice system seemed to be at its worst. The judge, who was supposed to be a neutral arbiter, sometimes seemed more intent on supporting the prosecution than on objectively examining the case. Every decision he made, every raised eyebrow at the prosecutor's questions, made James feel like he had already lost before the real fight had begun. As the prosecutor continued to push his line, James realized that the system itself was a complex machine that often ignored human stories. Instead of examining the circumstances, the court focused on details that confirmed biases. Every witness who took the stand reinforced existing stereotypes, highlighting how easily society judges without wanting to hear. The eyes of the people in the room darted between James and the prosecutor. They were looking for a hero. They were looking for a villain, without thinking about the real lives behind these labels. Someone had to make a choice, and that choice was not about what really happened, but about who was more comfortable in the role of criminal. James's lawyer tried to illustrate the system's true colors, insisting that James's actions were spontaneous and motivated by a desire to help. But every time she raised questions about his motivation and circumstances, the prosecutor returned the case to simple, black and white statements. "How can you be sure he didn't mean it?" the prosecutor asked, brushing aside the complexities. The sentence sounded like a death sentence, as if the court had already decided on guilt without hearing about James's suffering, fear, and courage. He felt a system designed to protect him turning into a machine that thirsted for blood. The room filled with somber faces, and even the lawyers present. some of whom were black, seemed unsure. They knew how often the system rejected people like James. His fight for justice was becoming not only personal, but part of a larger struggle against systemic racism and bias. For a moment, James felt that not only his life was at risk, but also the lives of all those who suffered from discrimination. He could not allow his story to end as another victim of a system that did not want to hear the truth. With every question the prosecutor asked, James knew he had to find the strength and fortitude within himself. He was ready to fight not only for his freedom, but for the right of every person to be heard, to not be judged simply because of the color of their skin. This was his fight, and he was not going to give up. James sat in the courtroom, and with every word the prosecutor said, he felt himself being humiliated. Every glance cast his way became heavy and full of contempt. It was not just a condemnation of his actions, it was a complete rejection of him as a person. When one of the witnesses, an older man, took the stand, James saw him look around the room with disdain. His voice shook as he recounted what had happened, but every word he spoke was laced with stereotypes. I saw him run for the car, but you know he was panicking, right? Black people always do stupid things, he said, and the words, full of prejudice, echoed in James's heart. The looks of the others present began to change. Some whispered, some sneered, and James felt himself being humiliated, as if he were part of some sinister spectacle. He tried not to notice, but these moments of contempt pierced him like icy arrows. Then it was the prosecutor's turn to ask questions. Do you really believe the defendant's actions were noble, or is this just another attempt to hide his true nature? He asked mockingly. James felt himself blushing with shame. His words and actions were being treated as a joke, and he had become the butt of ridicule. The crowd in the hall whispered, and James heard echoes of the words. He couldn't have done it if he were a normal person. That sense of old dignity that he had tried to maintain was falling apart. Every word sounded like a sentence. Every face looked at him with condemnation. As the hearing ended and his lawyer tried to escort him to the exit, he felt his shoulders growing heavy with humiliation. He walked past people who continued to whisper, exchange glances. No one wanted to see him as a man who had risked his life to save someone. They saw only stereotypes, and this exacerbated his sense of isolation. On the street, as he walked out of the courthouse, the world around him seemed even more hostile. The faces of passers-by, their looks full of condemnation and contempt, reminded him that he had become part of a system that did not want to hear him. James knew that this humiliation was just part of his struggle. He couldn't let bias cloud his true self. He had to find the strength to raise his voice, not just for himself, but for everyone who faced the same injustice. Even in his darkest moments, he knew his story mattered, and he wouldn't stay silent. Each court session was a repeat of the previous one. James sat before the judge and jury again, feeling his words disappear into the void. Despite his efforts to tell his truth, his voice remained silent in the noise of bias. Every time he tried to speak, the prosecutor interrupted him, and the judge often ignored his efforts to be heard. Your emotions don't matter, the prosecutor said when James tried to explain his actions. What matters is what you did, not how you felt. The words echoed around the courtroom, and James realized that his story was not only being ignored, but distorted. Every time he tried to explain why he had thrown himself into the fire to save the boy, his words came back to haunt him. It was an act of madness, one witness said, and James felt the label sticking to him. His sacrifice, his courage, his risk, had vanished under the weight of preconceived notions. The crowd in the courtroom didn't hear him. They saw only the image they had created of a black man who couldn't be a hero. In their eyes, he remained threatening, distorted, and nothing he said could change that. With each session, James felt his inner voice fading. At one of the hearings, he made up his mind and addressed the judge. I am not a criminal. I am just a person who wanted to help. But his words hung in the air like an empty sound. The judge just nodded, not paying attention, and returned to the discussion with the prosecutor. It was like a blow to the heart. His story was not only not heard, but also turned into a simple word without content. After the hearing, James walked out into the courtroom corridor where others were waiting for their turn. He felt isolated and unwanted. The looks people gave him told him he was part of a performance where his voice was suppressed. People whispered about him without knowing the real truth. And the situation highlighted again and again how easily society judges without wanting to listen. When he met his lawyer, she tried to encourage him. "You have to keep talking. Your story is important," she said, but there was a note of concern in her voice. James knew she was genuinely concerned about him, but he felt like every word he said only reinforced the wall that kept him from being understood. He continued to fight, but with each meeting his confidence waned. James began to wonder how many people with stories like his had been lost in a system that refused to listen. How many voices had been suppressed in the shadow of bias. He knew he couldn't let that happen to his story. Even if his words weren't heard now, he was prepared to fight for them to the end. With each court hearing, James became increasingly aware of how those around him were reacting to his situation. People's faces reflected two opposing emotions, support and betrayal. These feelings created an atmosphere of tension in the courtroom in which he felt vulnerable and alone. On one side of the room were those who truly believed in his innocence. Black faces, full of determination and support, looked at him with hope. They understood that behind this case was not just his fate, but much more a fight for justice, for the right to be heard. Every time they were there, he felt strength, and he tried to focus on their support, so as not to drown in negativity. On the other hand, there were those who saw him as a threat, who thought he represented everything bad about society. Their contempt was palpable. They whispered, they exchanged glances, and James felt their judgment like heavy shackles. This was especially evident in the words of those who did not know him but had already formed an opinion. He just wanted attention, he heard one witness say, and it left him with a deep pain. One day, as the trial was starting, the judge suddenly called a man to the stand to testify. It was an old acquaintance, a former colleague who seemed to agree to support him. However, as soon as he began to speak, James felt something inside him break. The familiar man he once trusted had become part of the prosecution's plan. "I remember James as a man who often lost his temper," the man said, his words laced with doubt. At that moment, James realized that his voice and the truth could be distorted even by those he trusted. The accusations coming from this man seemed like a betrayal, and he felt a shadow of despair creeping into his heart. There were whispers in the room, and James saw some of those who had supported him begin to waver. Maybe he really isn't what he seems, one thought. This betrayal from someone he knew only increased his isolation, and he felt his strength fading. When the hearing was over, he walked out into the hallway, where he was surrounded by journalists and spectators. Questions rained down on him from all sides. "What do you have to say in your defense?" Or "How do you explain your friend's behavior?" Each word was like a knife piercing his soul. He felt like people were looking for his weakness, eager to debunk his story. But at that moment, he saw a group of people who had come to support him, old friends, neighbors, even strangers who had heard his story. Their eyes were full of confidence. Their smiles reminded him that not all was lost. They had come to tell him that they believed in him, and that gave him strength. James knew it would be a long fight. He had to learn to differentiate between support and betrayal, to find the strength to stand up to those who wanted to break him. He knew his story was important not only to him, but to everyone who had ever felt isolated and misunderstood. He was ready to fight despite the pressure and betrayal, and his voice needed to be heard. James sat in his cell, feeling the world around him shrink to just four walls. Silence reigned, broken only by the sounds of guards' footsteps and the distant conversations of prisoners. Every day here seemed like the last, and each new dawn brought only another reminder that he was trapped. Life in prison was devoid of the usual joys. Instead of enjoying freedom, James faced cruelty that was not only physical but also emotional. He noticed that some guards treated prisoners with disdain, as if they were second-class citizens. Their cold stares and derogatory comments emphasized that many of them saw him not as a person, but as a symbol with prejudices and fears attached to it. Every day, the prisoners gathered in a common room where classes were held, but the atmosphere there was far from friendly. James noticed that racial bias was evident even in small ways. Prisoners were grouped together based on skin color, which increased tension. James tried to remain neutral, but his presence sometimes caused resentment among those who believed in stereotypes. One of the most difficult aspects was the daily interactions with other prisoners. Although many were willing to support each other, racism still reared its head in these circumstances. Comments about "you can't trust someone who looks different" were heard more than once, and James felt like their words cut into the core. But in these dark places, he found moments of humanity. He struck up conversations with some of the prisoners about their lives, their families, how they had ended up there. These conversations helped him stay afloat, reminding him that each prisoner had a story and was not alone in his struggle. He learned to listen and support, and it gave him strength. One of those supports was the library. Every week, James would go there to read. Books became his refuge, a place where he could escape from a harsh reality. He sought out literature that inspired him, taught him to fight and not give up. Reading gave him a glimpse into a world where preconceptions had no power. However, every day was a challenge. James felt the pressure mounting. He watched as some prisoners under pressure began to withdraw or, conversely, become aggressive. These changes frightened him. He knew he couldn't allow this to happen to himself, and he sought ways to cope with his emotions. Sometimes when times were tough, he would think about his family and why he was fighting. Every time he felt hopeless, he would think about the boy he had saved and how this fight was not just for him, but for those who could not be heard. It gave him strength, and he hoped that one day he would be free. Time passed slowly in prison, but James knew his story was not over. He continued to seek ways to communicate, to understand, and even in this confinement he tried to remain human. Life in prison could be brutal, but he did not allow himself to give in. With each passing day in prison, James became increasingly aware that his fight did not end outside these walls. He understood that even in prison, his voice still mattered, and he could not afford to give up. His life became focused on one thing: justice. A strong desire to change his fate was born inside him. James began to write. At first, these were notes about his feelings and experiences, but soon he realized that this could be his way of fighting. He decided to write a letter to the local newspaper, describing his story, drawing attention to the biases he faced, and to the wider issues of racial injustice. He spent every spare minute writing down his thoughts with clarity and passion. He shared his experiences in moments that showed how easily society judges people based on stereotypes. James wanted his words to reach people outside of prison, to see that his story was not just an incident, but part of a bigger picture. But he was haunted by the thought that his efforts might be in vain. He knew that many prisoners were trying to tell their stories, but their voices often went unheard. In those moments, James reminded himself that even if one voice was not heard, it did not mean that others could not step forward. He began organizing small discussions among the prisoners. They would gather in a quiet corner during their walks, sharing their stories, supporting each other. These conversations not only helped them, but also strengthened James. He realized that each of them had the right to be heard, and even in the darkest places, there was light to be found. At the same time, he continued to work with lawyers who were trying to prepare him for the next hearing. James was actively involved in preparing his defense, understanding the legal nuances, and this gave him a sense of control. He knew that every fact, every piece of evidence was an opportunity to change his fate. One evening, while he was working on his letter, one of the new prisoners looked into his cell. He was a young man who had just arrived and seemed lost. James invited him to join him and they began to talk. The young man told his story about how he had ended up there and how difficult it was for him to cope with reality. In this conversation, James felt that his fight for justice went beyond his personal story. He became a mentor to others, helping them find their voice. Every day, he heard new stories that complemented his own experience, and he realized that together they could change the way they were treated. Every day in prison was not just a day of survival, but a step toward change. James continued to write, organize talks, study the law, and inspire others. He knew his time would come, and he was not going to miss his chance. He believed that one day his story would not just be a tale of suffering, but a testament to the strength of the spirit that can overcome any obstacle. Sitting at the table in his cell, James held a piece of paper, neatly folded in half. His face was filled with concentration and determination. This letter had become more than just words to him. It was his voice, his cry for help and justice, to the world beyond the prison walls. He began writing in silence, only occasionally hearing the noise behind the doors as prisoners discussed their affairs. Every word was filled with his feelings, fear, hope and anger. He wrote about how his life had been turned upside down in a single moment when he had tried to do a good deed, and how his act had been twisted and turned into an accusation. "I'm here in prison, but I'm not a criminal. I'm a man who risked his life to save another," he began. The words came from his heart, and James felt like they were part of something bigger. He wanted his story to be heard, for people to understand that behind every accusation there was a real life. James went on to describe his life in prison, his daily trials and struggles with prejudice. He wrote about how hard it was to see other prisoners suffering from the same stereotypes as him. "We are all here for our own reasons, but that doesn't make us any worse or less human," he emphasized in his lines. Gradually, his letter took the form of a plea to the world. He shared his thoughts on justice, on how society often makes choices based on fear and ignorance. "We must stop judging people by their appearance or where they come from. Each of us deserves a chance to be heard," he wrote, knowing that his words could inspire others to fight bias. At that moment, James thought about what it was like to be in prison and feel isolated. He tried to convey his emotions so that those who read his letter would understand how important it is to remain human even in the most difficult conditions. "Here, among prisoners, I see a lot of kindness and support. We all dream of freedom, of the opportunity to be heard," he wrote, realizing that these words could become a bridge to understanding. James finished the letter, signing it with hope. He didn't know if it would reach anyone important, but in that moment he felt like he had done something meaningful. He had left a piece of himself on these pages, and it gave him strength. After he put the letter in an envelope and sent it through the guard, James felt a slight sense of relief. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that a new phase of struggle had begun in his life. His voice had been heard, even if only within these four walls, and he was ready to continue his story to inspire others and fight for justice. James stood at the window of his cell, watching the sun slowly set over the horizon. The orange and purple hues of the sky contrasted with the gray walls of the prison, and in that moment he felt a strange combination of hope and despair. A struggle raged within him, a question of what the future held. The letter he sent was a milestone for him. It wasn't just a message to the world, but an act of self-affirmation. He knew his voice could be heard, and that was hope. But with that came a sense of uncertainty. What would happen when his story was told? Would anyone be willing to listen to him, understand his suffering, and support him in his fight for justice? Every day in prison was a challenge. Despite the fellow prisoners and their support, James couldn't ignore the harsh reality they all faced. He saw many lose hope, despair robbing them of their strength. These observations filled him with fear that he might become one of them if he didn't fight to the end. At the same time, a desire to make a difference grew in his heart. He thought about how his fight could be part of a larger fight for justice. James understood that his story was not just his own, but also a reflection of the many people who suffered from bias and injustice. He dreamed of the day when his voice would be part of a larger cry for change, when the stories of people like him would be heard and taken into account. He began writing again, but these weren't just personal notes. He began collecting stories from other prisoners, creating something bigger, a collection of voices that needed an audience. 2. These stories reflected human nature, their struggles, their hopes and dreams. It was his answer to the challenge, and James knew that even from prison, he could make a difference in the world. With each passing day, he realized more and more that hope was not the absence of fear, but the ability to keep moving forward despite it. He was ready to fight for his freedom, for his truth, and for those who could not speak. A spark of determination ignited within him that was stronger than any hopelessness. As James returned to his desk and began writing again, he realized that justice might not come instantly, but every step along the way, every word, every interaction with others, could be the beginning of change. And though there were still many challenges ahead, he was prepared to face them with an open heart. James's story, his fight for justice and hope for a better future, became a symbol of resistance. He knew he was not alone in this journey. With every word he wrote, He was not just seeking freedom for himself, but also seeking to create a world where no one would be judged by the color of their skin or their circumstances. Hope and despair merged into one, and he chose hope. Dear viewers, we are very interested to know your opinion about this story. What emotions did it evoke in you? Have you ever experienced racism in your life? Share your thoughts in the comments. Every voice is important to us. You really mean a lot to us, and we appreciate each and every one of you. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new stories. Have a nice day. Thank you for being with us.